Hello everyone, welcome back to Annie Narrates. Here we like to review stories that beautiful people like yourselves post on the internet. Today's story's title goes like this. Mom abandoned me after dad cheated, and he took care of me along with my stepmom. Now mom wants to get back into my life 12 years later, but I straight up say no. Hello everyone, I have been a long time lurker on this sub, but for the first time, I am posting here. I, 26 female, have had a tumultuous relationship with my parents. Before I get into my story, I would like to say that I don't think either of my parents are saints. For example, my mom and dad had a horrible marriage, and they were into mutually toxic symbiotic relationships, with my mother being the more dominant one, although she was completely financially dependent on my dad. She would blame him for everything wrong in his life and would put him down any chance he got. If he was too ill or sick to work any day, she would try to gaslight him into saying that he was not quote-unquote manly enough, or if he could not pay the rent on time, she would mock that she should not have married a poor man like him. You see, my mother came from a rich family in Montana. She grew up around horses and tractors. Her father, my grandfather, is apparently a big man out there and has had a ranch passed down through generations. My dad used to work for my grandfather as a farmhand and came from a broken family with an alcoholic father. Despite completely different backgrounds, they fell in love, or what they thought was love. My mom was used to a life of privilege, and my dad came from a more modest background. I don't know how or why, but my mother thought that it was a good idea to marry my father, despite my grandfather opposing their reunion. He cut my mother off completely after her marriage, and my parents decided to move out to the city so they could find jobs and build a home for themselves. My dad was determined to create a stable life for my mother. He took on odd jobs, and eventually, he found a position as a mechanic in the city. The job didn't come to him easy, or so I have heard from my dad. Being a mechanic was a significant shift from his previous line of work, but he approached it with determination to learn and a willingness to adapt. The financial strain slowly began to ease, and my parents experienced a period of relative calm. This is when my parents decided to have a child, me, which was probably not such a good idea, since having a child is not easy. From a very young age, I remember seeing how my parents fought all the time. I used the word fight, when in reality, it would just be my mother taunting and my dad silently ignoring her. I saw how sad my mother was all the time. Accustomed to the comforts of her family's wealth, city life felt like a downgrade for my mom, and she made it very clear to my dad every day. She resented the fact that he couldn't provide the same level of luxury that she was accustomed to by her father. Their arguments became a regular occurrence, and as a child, I became a silent witness to their toxic relationship. My mother's frustration must have grown even more after having me, as she felt trapped in a life that she deemed beneath her. She continued to belittle my dad, who, in turn, became even more withdrawn and started to spend his evenings drinking at a bar. I knew my dad hated drinking because late one night when I was 5 years old, I watched my dad stumble into our house drunk and was unable to walk properly. He sat timidly down on the sofa while removing his shoes and looked around to see that I was awake and watching him. He met my gaze with a mixture of shame and sadness, and he struggled to maintain his composure. He mustered the courage to speak. "I'm sorry you had to see this, sweetheart," he whispered, his words slurring slightly. "I don't want you to think this is okay. I hate that I'm slowly turning into my father." I remember his words distinctly because I had never seen tears in his eyes before. Things reached a breaking point when one night, my mother discovered that my dad had cheated on her. He had slept with someone he met at the bar, and the next day, he confessed to her immediately during dinner when he returned from work. My mother was understandably furious and started screaming and throwing things at him. The accusations, the anger, and the hurtful words echoed through the house. She screamed how he was a coward and she should have listened to her father and never married a lowly man like him, how he didn't deserve someone like her and she had just had enough. My dad kept pleading with her, saying how she knew this was a huge mistake and he was never going to let it happen again. The fight reached a point of no return. Fueled by anger, betrayal, and resentment, she declared that she was leaving. The gravity of her words hung in the air. and I felt this sinking feeling in the pit of my stomach. Desperation etched across his face. My father begged for another chance, promising that he would do whatever it took to mend their fractured relationship. But my mother remained resolute, indifferent to his pleas. I begged my mother to reconsider, my voice cracking with desperation only a 14-year-old could feel. I implored her not to abandon our family, clinging to the hope that she would choose me. However, with tears streaming down her face, she turned to me, her words dripping with a mixture of resentment and desperation. "I can't stand to look at you. Not when your face is a constant reminder of the man who destroyed my life," she declared, her eyes locking onto mine. My eyes widened in shock, and I couldn't believe her words. "Please, Mom, don't leave. I need you," I implored, my voice cracking with a mix of desperation and fear. But her decision was made. Fueled by her own pain and a desire for something different, she began packing her bags in the middle of the night. I watched helplessly as my mother walked away from our lives without a second glance. I found out later from my dad that she was living with her sister and trying to get in touch with her father, my grandfather, so she could return back to her home. A week later, her sister's husband, who was a lawyer, served the divorce papers to my dad. Up until then, I thought that my mother would eventually return, but after watching my dad that night cry himself to sleep, clutching the divorce papers, I knew that she was done with us. I resented my father for cheating on my mother, but I resented my mother even more for choosing to abandon me and punish me for something that was beyond my control. The days that followed were rough. Our home, once lively, felt empty without her. My dad, who was heartbroken, struggled to cope with our changed life. The school became my escape, a place where I could forget about the mess at home. But coming back to an empty house each day reminded me of how much I missed my mom. My dad tried to shield me from the pain, but I could see it in his eyes. I have to say that no matter how tough it was for my dad during those times, he still went to work every day to ensure that we had food on the table, and this is why I have always respected my dad. Every morning before school, he would cook breakfast for me and pack my lunch. On the weekends, he would teach me to do my own laundry so I could be an independent person. I think this helped me to become a more responsible human being than I currently am. The divorce process went by fast. My dad didn't have much in terms of property, and my mom didn't want anything to do with him. When it came to deciding who would have custody of me, my dad suggested that they should share parenting responsibilities equally. However, my mom refused and handed over full custody to my dad. It felt like she was completely done with being a parent, leaving my dad to take care of me on his own. I hate to write this, but it physically hurt me to know that my mother didn't want anything to do with me. I was too young to go through this, but I tried to remain strong for my father. I knew that he was hurt by this too. The one good thing that came from my parents' divorce was that I didn't have to come back to my parents fighting. There were no more screaming matches that shook our walls. Although I miss my mother, I slowly learned to appreciate my life with my father. The atmosphere at home became calmer, and there was a sense of stability that I hadn't experienced before. As the weeks passed, my dad and I developed a strong bond. He took on the roles of both parents, ensuring that I had everything that I needed emotionally and physically. We did face financial struggles from time to time, but my dad's unwavering commitment to my well-being never wavered. When I turned 16, I decided to get a part-time job for myself and save some money for college. I ended up going to a good college with a full scholarship due to my excellent grades. When I graduated college, I remember seeing how proud my dad was. He was always a silent man who hardly spoke, but that day he cheered on the loudest. I was happy with how my life had turned out. Through the years, my mother had never tried to contact me, and neither did I bother to have her in my life anymore. After securing a job as an accountant, I made it a point to visit my dad as often as possible. Witnessing his solitude as he aged, I began to feel a deep sense of concern for his well-being. Wanting to see him happy, I gently suggested to my dad that he should consider dating someone. At first, he hesitated, unsure of whether he was ready to open his heart to someone new, and then he started to mock that no one would want to date an old man like him. However, as our conversations continued, I could see that he might be open to entertaining the idea. As luck would have it, my dad met Tracy, a 48-year-old divorcee, thanks to one of his friends who introduced both of them. They spent more and more time together, and Tracy's warm and friendly demeanor brought a new energy into my dad's life. My dad introduced me to her quite early on since he wanted my opinion on her. There was a sincerity in her eyes that immediately put me at ease. She had lost both her son and her husband at a fire, and she had gone through enough grief of her own. Despite that, she had a very warm and genuine presence from the beginning. Over time, I have observed her kindness and attentiveness not only towards my dad but also towards me. Witnessing my dad find happiness with Tracy was a surreal experience. Tracy's presence brought a sense of balance to our lives. I couldn't help but feel grateful that my dad had discovered a second chance at love. When they decided to get married, I happily accepted to become Tracy's maid of honor. It was both an honor and a privilege. The wedding day was a beautiful affair, filled with laughter, love, and the promise of a new beginning. I have to say that it was one of the happiest days of my life, and I could see genuine happiness on my dad's face for the first time in a long time. Over the years, Tracy and I built a bond that went beyond the conventional stepmother-stepdaughter relationship. She has watched me go through heartbreaks and comforted me whenever she could. She has been my confidant and given me advice whenever I needed any. Our lives have been going great so far. Unfortunately, I guess good times don't last long, because out of nowhere, 2 weeks ago, my dad received a letter at his place addressed to me. He asked me if I was supposed to receive mail, but I wasn't sure, so on the weekend when I went to visit him, I checked the letter. To my shock, it was a letter from my mother. My hand shook as I immediately recognized her handwriting and the way that she had addressed it as Bunny. Now, the only person who had ever called me that was my mother. As a child, I was extremely energetic and would run around a lot, so my mother had started to endearingly call me Bunny. In her letter, my mother expressed a desire to reconnect with me after all these years. She had written how she wanted to get in contact with me a long time ago, but didn't have the courage to do so. In the letter, she had written how she acknowledged her past mistakes and the pain that she had caused me by abandoning me. She wrote how unhappy she was in her marriage with my dad, and in her anger, had decided to take it out on the world, including me. She claims to have undergone significant personal growth and wanted an opportunity to rebuild a relationship with me. At the end of the letter, she provided her phone number, requesting me to call her anytime. Reading her words stirred a complex array of feelings within me. The wounds from my childhood were still present, and the scars of her abrupt departure ran deep. I had built a life without her, found happiness with Tracy and my dad, and had no desire to revisit a painful past. I shared the contents of the letter with my dad and Tracy. My dad's face turned white as a sheet as he read the letter. He then told me that he would stand by and support me no matter what decision I made, even though he never wanted to see that woman ever again. Tracy nodded, saying that I should do what I feel comfortable about, keeping in mind that my well-being and emotional health are my top priorities. Ever since that letter was sent to me, I have not been able to sleep properly. I couldn't understand why my mother would decide to reach out to me out of nowhere. Something didn't feel right, especially the desperation reeking from her words in the letter, so I decided to reach out to her yesterday on call to satisfy my curiosity. When I dialed her number and the phone began to ring, my heart raced with each passing ring. Finally, a woman answered, and I knew it was my mother. Her familiar voice, tentatively asking who it was. "Hi, it's me," I replied, my voice steady but guarded. "I got your letter." There was a moment of silence, and then she spoke. "I can't believe you called me." I told her that I couldn't believe it either, since she was the one who had chosen to abandon me and decided to reach out to me when it was convenient for her. My mother kept quiet and then spoke, her words carefully chosen. She reiterated how she had missed me every day and how she had longed to get back in touch with me, but didn't have the courage to do so. I scoffed hearing her words because, honestly, I didn't believe her. Unable to contain my uncertainty, I asked, "What prompted you to write the letter now? Why reach out after so much time?" I could hear her take a deep breath, and she told me how we should meet since she wanted to tell me something. I refused and told her that she could tell me whatever she wanted right now so we could be done with this charade. My mother then opened up to me that she had been diagnosed with breast cancer. I froze hearing her words. She told me how she had been having pains in her chest area, and when she recently got it checked, the doctors discovered a lump. My mother told me how getting diagnosed with cancer made her rethink every decision that she had ever made in her life. She told me that she didn't want to die without letting me know how much she regretted not being there for me, and now that God was punishing her, she was seeking my forgiveness. While I remained speechless hearing her story, she continued to tell me how she wanted to get back into my life so she could start being a good parent to me. While the gravity of her illness evoked a sense of empathy, it didn't erase the years of pain and abandonment. "I'm sorry to hear about your diagnosis," I finally managed to say, my voice tinged with a mix of sympathy and detachment. "But that doesn't change the past or decisions you made 12 years ago by giving me up." I continued to tell that I had built a life where I had found happiness with my dad and stepmom, who had taken care of me, so I didn't need her anymore. I told her that if it was forgiveness that she wanted, then she could rest since I had nothing to forgive her, and my life was complete without her in it. I guess hearing this must have hurt my mother, because I could hear her start to weep on the other end. All choked up, her voice wavered as she continued to express remorse and a desperate desire for reconciliation. Despite her heartfelt words, a part of me remained skeptical. In the end, I thanked her for her honesty and said that I needed time to process everything. The call ended, leaving me in a state of contemplation. Now that I am writing this on Reddit, I feel guilty. I can't forget the sad voice of my mother as she kept pleading with me to reconsider. So Reddit, am I the a-hole for not letting my mother back into my life when she abandoned me 12 years ago? Thank you so much for the overwhelming response to my post. While a lot of you understand my decision to not let my mother back into my life, the other half of you have written things about how the family needs to forgive and how my mother is genuinely remorseful now that she has cancer, so I need to cherish the time that I have left with her. I can see and understand these points, but I have to admit that my heart still aches for the 14-year-old me who was abandoned by her. I wish I could go back and hug myself. I didn't mention this before, but for a long time, I blamed myself for my parents' divorce. I thought that if maybe I was not born, my dad could have taken care of my mother better and given her everything that she wanted. I also sometimes wish that I didn't look so much like my father, so my mother wouldn't have abandoned me for being so alike to him. However, over the years, I have realized that my mother was an adult and had plenty of time to recognize her mistakes, but she didn't. I have talked with my father and Tracy about my conversation with my mother. I know my dad is a bit hurt and distressed thinking about the pain that I am in, and reiterated his support for whatever I decide to do. Eventually, I realized that my mother was right and that I needed to see her face to face to understand the crux of this matter. I want to give her the benefit of the doubt and see if she has really changed for the better. I will reach out to her to see if she wants to meet with me this week. Hey guys, I know it's been a while since I updated. Even though I wanted to update sooner, I needed some time to feel better. As updated earlier, I decided to meet with my mother face to face, and things didn't go exactly like I had imagined. First of all, when I went to meet with my mother alone, she decided to show up with her new husband and my aunt. I was shocked to see this, since she never gave me a heads up about it before. Regardless of this, I greeted them politely, and we sat down to order some food before we proceeded to talk. My mother was the first to speak, commenting on how much I had grown and complimenting how beautiful I looked now. I smiled awkwardly. We engaged in small talk for a while, discussing general topics like my job, my life currently, and my graduation. Eventually, my mother steered the conversation towards her life after divorcing my dad. She told me how she had tried to reach out to her dad, who over time decided to forgive her. She started working at his ranch since sitting idle brought back painful memories about her failed marriage. She spoke about how she had always been a country girl through and through, so living in her hometown somehow healed her, and eventually she met her current husband, Dennis, who was also a ranch owner just like her dad. What shocked me was what she said afterwards. It turns out that Dennis was a divorcee himself and had 2 children of his own. I can't write exactly how betrayed I felt when my mother went on to talk nonchalantly about how Dennis and his children changed her life. She turned to Dennis smiling and holding his hand as she recounted how they eventually got married and she is the stepmom of his children. Although I was trying to be mature by understanding that she had found another partner who made her happy, what was hitting hard was that she had embraced two complete strangers as her children while completely abandoning me. Then she spoke about her health, bringing up her recent diagnosis of breast cancer. She explained how she had stage 2 cancer and the news had given her a much needed reality check, so she had finally mustered up the courage to reach out to me. I mustered my courage so I could express my feelings to her and asked her straight up how she could ever give up full custody during her divorce from my dad and if she remembered her last words to me. The air grew heavy with tension as my mother looked away from me embarrassed. My aunt, coming to her defense, told me how I had no idea how much my mother has regretted that decision and how miserable she had been all these years. I smiled at my aunt Riley and told her that if my mother was genuinely that sad, she would have reached out to me sooner and not abandoned me and tried to play stepmom to Dennis's children. I turned to look at Dennis, who sat there silently, and asked him if he knew what my mother had told me the last time I ever saw her. He glanced at my mother, who was quiet, and shook his head. I recounted how my mother had told me that I looked like my father and reminded her of what my father had done, so she chose to leave me behind. I admit that at this point, I might have crossed the line, but I wanted my mother to hurt the way that she hurt me. I could feel the sting in my eyes, but I went on to say how for weeks on end, I would cry myself to sleep while hearing my dad do the same on the other end. How I had to explain to my friends why my mother chose to abandon me every time they asked me why I only had a single parent. How it hurt me to not see my mother in my graduation while everyone else had their parents cheering for them. My mother, hearing the pain in my voice, started to shed tears, and my aunt squeezed her hand in support. I then turned to my aunt and told her that even though my mother chose to abandon me that day, she could have stayed in touch with me over the years. However, she chose not to do so. My aunt glanced at my mother and told me how she needed to be there for her sister more than me and that their father, my grandfather, didn't want any of them to contact my father. I was not satisfied with her answer, and it seemed like a lame excuse to me, since my mother could have divorced my dad and continued to have a relationship with me. I don't know why I was punished in this entire ordeal. As much as I wanted to ask more, I realized that it didn't really matter if my grandfather could have had a hand behind this, since I had never met him, so I couldn't blame him. I told my mother that I needed to meet her one time to see if this could work, but now that I have, I can see that I don't want her in my life anymore. This is when my mother, while choking back tears, told me how this wasn't the only reason that she had contacted me. She then told me that it was time for her to draw up a will and she wanted to leave the money behind for me as a gesture to make amends for her past wrongdoings. This sudden revelation caught me off guard, but I honestly didn't want anything from her. I might not have a lot in life, but my dad had always taught me to work hard for everything that I wanted, so I straight up told her that this was completely her decision and that I didn't need anything from her. I clarified that I didn't want her to use this excuse to force me to accept her into my life, and my mother nodded in understanding. She reiterated that although she wished that she could go back in time and change what she had done, she understood my decision to not let her back in. My aunt tried to convince me one last time, saying how I might regret not knowing my mother at all, even though I had the chance, but I knew deep in my heart that I was happier without her. We parted ways, and my mom gave me a tight hug as farewell. I did come back home and cried myself a river over what had happened, but so far, I don't regret what I have done. It's been 5 months since my last update. I can't believe the last time I updated this, I was so sad and miserable. I remember crying while typing out the words, but in a matter of months, my life has gone back to normalcy. I have continued to have a strong relationship with my dad and Tracy. They have always been there for me through thick and thin. My dad has recently been teaching me fishing, something that he loves to do during the weekends. Spending my weekends with my dad has brought us even closer together. As time has gone by, I have learned to focus on taking care of myself and getting therapy to deal with all the emotional stuff coming up again. I am still in the process of healing, and I feel comforted by the support of my chosen family. I haven't reached out to my mother, although she sometimes does send me a long message telling me how much she misses me and how her treatment is going. I understand that the door hasn't completely shut when it comes to my future with my mother. In the end, I have realized that it is up to me to decide whether to let my mother back in my life or keep my distance. If I ever decide to forgive her in the future, it will happen when I am completely ready. Right now, I am putting my own healing first and valuing the relationships that have brought love and stability into my life. And that was a wrap up for today's story. Thank you very much for listening. Go ahead and smash that like button for me and subscribe for more stories. Thanks again, and we'll be seeing you in the next one.